Okay, we're going to shift into the colonial period simply because that's where sort of everything that makes this region what it is today sort of happens. And the first part of this is sort of the bizarre sort of ego attitude that you see, especially with the early European empires, specifically the Portuguese and the Spanish. Portuguese and the Spanish, despite that they're next to each other, really don't like each other very much. And in the 1500s, they're almost constantly at war with each other, which is sort of odd given the small size of Portugal. But Portugal is the first one of the European powers off the off to the races in terms of maritime or naval uh, design. And so the Portuguese naval empire really becomes the first big European oomph, if you want to think of it that way. And of course, what they do is, as I mentioned last time, is they basically swallow up the Arab trade routes. So basically, moving around Africa, let's zoom in here. Moving around Africa, what they do is they're moving from Portugal here. Basically, they set up colonies along the coast of Africa, and eventually, once they access India, and they start moving through here. They set up colonies. Goa was a Portuguese colony on India too, really recently. And of course, eventually they end up in China, Macau being the Portuguese colony in China, again, the first one. And so the Portuguese are the first ones to tap the hugely tempting resources in this particular region. But ironically, one of the major reasons they're out here, they're sort of after three things. One was silk, the other was pearls. Because very early on, in fact, throughout almost all of West Asia and Europe, in fact, even a lot of East Asia, there's a really persistent thought that pearls can do several things. One is they can calm you down. In fact, you can still go to Chinatown, for example, buy pearl powder that you consume. But probably most importantly or most famously was in a lot of the world, sort of the Eurasian world, pearls were seen as an antidote to poisons. Which is really a popular way to get rid of your competition in this area. So if you had pearls in drinks or you had more pearls around you, it would protect you from evil, but specifically sorcery, but most specifically poisons. Now, of course, pearls being an organic substance tend to dissolve. So over time, your pearls are going to shrink and then disappear. And so pearls were a huge in-demand resource to the extent that having wealth in much of Eurasia, specifically, especially in Europe, even in the Roman period, but certainly after that, the medieval period, was the idea of having pearls. And this is why if you look at gowns of very, very wealthy people in Europe, they'll frequently have pearls stitched in as decoration, or people would wear a pearl necklace, or you'd have pearls on a crown or something. That wasn't just affectation. That was basically saying, one, I'm protecting myself from evil, but two, pearls were incredibly expensive. And so having them and displaying them basically said, I've got it, you don't. The more pearls I got, the better off I am. So the whole even sort of current fascination with pearls has to do with this sort of mindset of what you might call the mystical value of the pearl. Now, the third is actually one that is ironically something you find right here. And that's spices. Almost all the stuff that you see today, if you go into a grocery store and you buy spices, whether it be cinnamon, cloves, all this type of stuff, it actually comes from a cluster of islands over here in the Celebes region. And throughout Asia, those were traded, fairly consistently, sort of island, place to place. So people had them. But when the Europeans sort of find these, the Romans had access to some of them. That collapses. And the Arabs then, of course, make a huge business out of trading the spices. In fact, that's one of, I think, two of the Sinbad stories have to do with Arab trade from this area going down here, collecting spices and coming back. If they got those to Europe, they were worth a gazillion dollars, even for a small handful of something. Specifically cloves, which for some reason I think, cloves are real popular because they tend to hide the smell of rotted meat. You have to remember, since there wasn't refrigeration, a lot of meat didn't smell very good by the time you ate it. In fact, you still see this with the idea of stuff that you have around the holidays, Christmas or Thanksgiving, where you have cloves in the meat. That's actually a leftover from the sort of late Roman medieval idea of the function of spices, which actually was to protect you from, rot and other aspects. And so that was the other main thing that the Portuguese wanted. The Portuguese knew that the Arabs had pearls and the Arabs had ways to get spices. Portuguese didn't know where those were from. They sure as hell knew they wanted them. A lot of the pearls actually come from this area. But a lot of the rest of the pearls come again, from Southeast Asia. And of course, the spices come almost entirely from Southeast Asia. So that was the main motivation for the Portuguese to sail around Africa, take the risk of going to India, take the risk of going here to get back home. Sailing thousands of miles was only for boxes of spices and boxes of pearls, and occasionally silks and other stuff, but that's really what they were mainly after. Now, since the Portuguese and the Spanish couldn't stand each other, the Spanish decided what was ever good enough for the Portuguese was good enough for them. They tried to go the same way the Portuguese did, and the Portuguese blew them out of the water. And then the Spanish basically thought, well, to hell with this. And this is why Columbus was able to get sponsorship from the Spanish Empire. So the Spanish king gives him money to sail this way with the idea that you cut across the Atlantic and then you're going to get to Asia. Of course, they didn't realize that the Americas existed. And that's, of course, the Columbus voyages. And so what happens is the Spanish Empire initially has a good old time discovering all these goodies on the Americas, gold, silver, jade, all the rest of the stuff. But the fascinating thing about this is to realize that the Spanish were never happy with that. Right down through the 1600s, the Spanish saw the Americas, especially the Spanish Americas, which were about 70% of it, as basically being a speed bump because they were still fixated on this. They wanted the stuff from China, but they most specifically wanted the pearls and spices from here. Now, the Portuguese, of course, had this stuff, and they're sort of going like, nah, because we got it, you don't. The Spanish and the Portuguese were going at it full time in a pretty brutal combat. And finally, they go to the Pope, who just basically tells them, hey, you guys are both Catholic, you're supposed to behave yourselves, and you're both supposed to be protecting the, Catholic Empire, so, get your act together. And so what he does, he literally splits the planet up and basically says, I can never remember the name of the treaty, I'm going to say it's Tordesillas, but I don't remember. He basically says the Portuguese control everything in this part. So because they were the first ones to do it, anything from basically Portugal east to the Philippines is Portuguese turf. The Spanish, because they went this way, get everything that's west of Spain till it hits, Asia, or basically the east side of the Philippines. And that's how they split up the world. And neither side pays a lot of attention to that. The Portuguese Empire actually collapses pretty quickly. They just don't have the ability to the stamina or economic wherewithal to make this work. But they were making a ton of money really quick. And of course, then the Dutch, who are the next players in the game, go like, if the Portuguese can manage that, and the Dutch come up, since the Portuguese, of course, while they were Catholic, the Dutch weren't. The Dutch were Protestants. The Dutch come up here and they do a little religion editing. At the same time, they swallow up this whole empire and end up turning this into Dutch territory, which you have to remember that Indonesia, for example, was Dutch right until 1941. And in fact, after World War II, was Dutch for a short time afterwards till it got its independence. The British and the French come in here. The French never really get their act together for whatever set of reasons. I think because they're fascinated with North America. The British come in here and they basically do the same thing. They're coming both by virtue of coming this way across the Atlantic, but by the time the British get going, there's such a massive amount of percentage of the whole sort of naval movement of goods and resources globally that they just come by and they just start swallowing up everything. So rather than trading with India, they take over India. Rather than trading with the populations here, they eventually take over what's called now Malaysia. They take over what's now called Burma. They basically swallow up all this area unless some other European power has already got their fingers in it. And then, of course, when they get China, they take over colonies there, including Guangzhou, at least in part. It used to be called Canton, of course, Hong Kong. So the British become the huge new players. Now, again, for all these European groups, the only one being even the Portuguese don't treat this area differently. I think, again, because you didn't have existing empires here that the Europeans bump into, that they tended to see this whole area as, again, sort of as a speed bump. It was the way of getting to stuff they wanted. And think also because the spices were almost entirely, they're harvested. In fact, they're actually it's a very complex form of agriculture to do this sort of tree agriculture, most of it. But to the Europeans, they didn't see it as agriculture. They just saw this particular area had these mystical plants, had all these mystical properties in their bark or their seeds, and they wanted it. And so what you find here is sort of really sort of brutal, straightforward colonialism because they're just taking the resources. They want the spices, they want the rubber, they want the whatever they're going to get out of this region. And in large part, they also see this in the way of where they want to be, which is China. Now, probably the goofiest of all of this is that the Portuguese, who originally controlled this area, gets taken over by the Dutch. The Dutch control this area. The Spanish come in pre-Dutch at the time the Portuguese do, And they basically end up here in the northern part of the Philippines, very simply for the fact that by the time they've sailed across the Pacific, their ships are in such crappy shape that they need access to a place to repair ships. And so they discover, in quotes, the harbor around Manila, now called Manila Bay, more accurately the Tagalog population center. And the Spanish just sort of casually come in and claim it. The Spanish were wont to do. In the same period of time, they go and they claim Guam and the Northern Marianas for the same reason. They want these in terms of transact from basically the Americas, specifically the west coast of Mexico, to China. And so the Spanish set up shop here. It says something about the way the Europeans viewed this region, that even though the Spanish set up shop by the early mid 1600s in the area around Manila, they don't even bother mapping the rest of the Philippines for another 150, almost 200 years, which is pretty weird when you think about it, given the fact that it's a territory. So they're a governor of an area, they don't even know what the area is. And to be honest, they don't even care because they don't see any profit in it. The only profit they get is if they go west to China, or if they go down here and maybe take some of the stuff from the Celebes, but they have a hard time with that because that's by now the Dutch. So what happens is you end up in this weird sort of overlay. Dutch control this area, the British control this area, the Spanish control this area, but no one's really all that interested in this region. And the reason this becomes incredibly complicated is what you find is the Dutch are in this region, but by the time the Arabs have moved across prior to the Dutch, of course, they brought Islam. So this whole section here pretty much because, ends up Muslim. This is moving very quickly into the Philippines, and then it sort of comes to a halt for whatever set of reasons. And then when the Spanish come in, of course, they see the only reality as being Catholicism. So the Spanish come in here and pretty much at gunpoint force the populations here to be Catholic. And so what you find is you end up with this very sort of surreal division of the northern part of the Philippines being Catholic, Christian, and all the rest of this region being pretty much, Islam, Muslim, with some of the regions like Bali, for example, they're still largely Hindu, which again is part of this original movement of folks out of here. Southeast Asia, the land part, Vietnam, Cambodia, et cetera, pretty much is all tied to China. And so what you find is basically various forms of what you might call Taoist, but of course Buddhism comes in and becomes a huge, and still today is a very powerful factor in much of this region. Down in the southern part of Malaysia, what you find is actually a split between Hindu, Buddhist populations in the north and Muslim populations in the south, which is a huge political problem for the country, Thailand also. So what happens is in the colonial period, you have this weird sort of vague boundary where the Dutch are here, and they're not really importing Protestantism, their version of Christianity. So the population is sort of doing their own sort of thing. To the north, the Spanish very aggressively are promoting Catholicism. Now, where it becomes, of course, key is in the 20th century when these areas become independent, or independence starts to loom, is what you find is you've got this split between religions in a whole cluster of islands where there's no particular rational reason why the religions should be split, except for the colonial overlords and how they treated the populations. So one of the huge differences between Southeast Asia and, say, China is that the Southeast Asian region never really has, like I mentioned last time, really doesn't have political empires. And that means when the Europeans come in, they don't treat them as collectives. They treat them as little spots. So the British think nothing of, for example, making Singapore into a separate entity from Malaysia, even though they run both of them. I'm not particularly sure why. I've never looked into it, but they just do. The French take over this part of what's now Vietnam, Cambodia, and turn that into French Indochina. The Dutch have this whole section here. But no one's interested either in the complex ethnic patterns that you find throughout here. There's a ton of different cultures in this region, totally different languages, totally different cultural systems in place. The Philippines has over, I think, 180 or 190 languages if you actually include the islands in the Philippines, some which are now part of Indonesia. It's just incredible. Even Luzon, the main island, has roughly, I think, 14 or 16 entirely separate languages. So when you're talking about unity, you don't have it in the sense that you don't have some sort of shared historical, linguistic, cultural thing that ties you all together, unlike, for example, much of India, with your Hindu and various type of influences, at least religiously. Of course, in China, it tends to be very unified in terms of language and culture for much of the country under the Han. You don't find this in this region. you find larger populations that control regions. So for example, the ethnic Vietnamese control the coastal areas here, ethnic Cambodians, the Khmer, for example, over here. You've got different populations, but they didn't really control large political entities, and the Europeans don't do anything to make that happen for a bunch of reasons, but I think a lot of it's just lack of interest. All this area was seen as a place that you had to manage, but it wasn't really a place you could make a lot of money from. In this regard, it's sort of a precursor to what we'll find when the Europeans take over large parts of Africa. They just don't see a lot to be made out of it. So they're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about it, organizing it, or building infrastructure or doing stuff. And the classic example would be the British are controlling a lot of this area. But they do very little compared to the amount of effort they spend in India to make India part of the British Empire. I mean, Malaysia, Singapore, even more so, Burma, they sort of could care less. The Dutch, never do anything, for much to make what's now Indonesia their empire, except to sort of manage them. But again, it's take the resources out. So in the historic period till the 20th century, this area is very marginal to almost all the players. And that pretty much stays the same until the early mid 20th century, when ironically, the great thing that sort of fuels a lot of change in a lot of the world is the discovery that you have, oil, large amounts of oil in this area, and of course, especially up here in Brunei and what's now the South China Sea. So the reality that there's oil, then all of a sudden makes the Dutch pay more attention to this region because they control the oil pretty much. The French are trying to figure out how to get access to it, and they never do. And of course, if we get into the World War II, this is why the Japanese invade and take over this region. They want the oil resources, and of course, largely the rubber synthetic resources that you find in Malaysia. So again, everyone wants this region for the resources, but no one sees it as sort of a collective entity. And so, the players change, but the attitudes don't. The United States takes over the Philippines in 1898 as a short, very brutal war with a large part of the northern Philippines population that cannot handle the American lack of fulfilling of promises for independence. In fact, the war keeps on going in the South. In Mindanao, the war goes on for another 15 years between the United States and the locals. So the United States takes over this region, but even for the Americans, there's a huge pressure in the United States to just sort of dump the region because they can't see how they're going to make any money out of it. They don't see what it's worth. It's just a real hassle. In total contrast, for example, than how the Americans see Hawaii, which is they right from the get-go, they've said, oh, this is a really useful resource to keep. But the Philippines, it's just, they end up with it, and it's sort of like, well, now what do we do? And if you think about it, that's just an echo of the British and the Dutch and the Portuguese and everyone else for this whole region. Now, what this means is sort of jumping ahead is when we end up with the late 20th century and these places become independent. Independence tends to be shaped by one, boundaries that the Europeans put in place, and two, by the largest or most astute ethnic groups that tend to take over regions, which is one reason why there's still a lot of conflict in this region, especially right now in Myanmar, is you never have boundaries defined by ethnicity or shared history or anything like that. You have boundaries that were sort of vaguely slapped on by Europeans, and whoever's the most powerful, the locals, sort of jumps on the bandwagon and they take it over and now becomes the country of Indonesia or whatever. In this regard, if you think about it, it's actually very similar to what we looked at in this particular region here in West Asia, where the boundaries of countries today really don't bear any sort of relationship to the language, ethnic, culture groups of the region. They tend to be based on, again, colonial politics, if you would. So this is sort of a replay of that, except worse. This is one reason why this area tends to be very unstable politically for much of this region, because why they're a country isn't particularly well defined by a large part of the population.